This is the Energy Education Podcast for November 18th, 2012. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairewinds Energy Education. Fairewinds is a non-profit organization dedicated to educating policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. On today's show, we'll discuss the status of the Fukushima Daiichi fuel pools and the progress being made to move the fuel rods to safety. We'll also talk about a recent article published in the Japan Times that looks at high levels of radiation now being found in the freshwater fish of Japan. While we're on the topic of contamination, we'll discuss high levels of radiation found in a dirt sample collected in a Tokyo suburb. Joining us from the road via Skype is Fairewinds Chief Nuclear Engineer Arnie Gundersen. Coming up next. Okay, Arnie, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, Kevin, I'm glad I could come.
Arnie, we've had a lot of listener questions about the status of the fuel pools and the recovery effort at the Fukushima Daiichi site in Japan. Can you just give us a small update? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there was some important new information out this week that I'd love to talk about. But let's talk it working backward from Unit 4. Unit 4 is a slow but steady progress, and Tepco is building a box around Unit 4 and pretty much planning on the traditional way of removing the nuclear fuel with a large overhead crane and that can lift as much as 110 tons. That would be the shielded cask that the nuclear fuel would be placed in. You know, Ambassador Akio Matsumura and I have been pushing Tokyo Electric to move much faster, but they seem to be sort of methodically building a structure that's along traditional lines. I've said before, if there's no earthquake, they'll be able to successfully offload the fuel over the next 3, 4, 5 years, and hopefully it's a race against time. But if there's no earthquake, Unit 4 could be successfully offloaded with the approach Tokyo Electric's taken. My only problem is they're just moving too slow.
So the point of this structure around Unit 4 is to support the crane that will be needed to lift the fuel rods out of the fuel pool.
Yeah, there's two. The structure is going to contain the radiation because the fuel is still boiling, the building still is radioactive, so the structure is going to continue to contain the radiation, and then it's also, more importantly, strong enough to handle the large crane required to move the nuclear fuel.
So a structure being built around Unit 4, both to contain the radiation and to provide the support needed to lift those fuel rods out of the fuel pool as fast as possible. Arnie, what's happening at Unit 3?
Yeah, that's where the new information came out from Tokyo Electric this week. Unit 4, the building under the fuel pool is strong enough to handle the weight of this large crane. They are anchoring the crane to the containment structure in Unit 4. But what happened this week is that Tokyo Electric released a press release, and the approach on Unit 3 is entirely different than the approach on Unit 4.
So they need to get these fuel rods out of the Unit 3 fuel pool. They're also building a structure. What's different about that?
Yeah, they have to get it out, but they can't get it out the same way. Tokyo Electric's not saying that, but in providing details of the drawing for Unit 3, they're clearly showing that Unit 3 can't be done as Unit 4 was, and therein lies a whole bunch of important analysis. We're putting the pictures of the Unit 3 structure on the website, so viewers can follow along here with me as I'm talking. Unit 3 is entirely different than Unit 4.
What's different about Unit 3?
Well, if you look at the picture, instead of it being the box that's been built over Unit 1 and now being built over Unit 4, they built something that looks like a superstore in a mall. It's got a bump in the middle of it that could easily look like a retail outlet. In fact, when you look at the plant in the drawing that's on page 5 of the Tokyo press release, they're looking at the side of the structure from the land, looking out toward the ocean. And you see this bump in the middle of the building. Well, that bump is there to allow the nuclear fuel moving equipment to have adequate clearance to pull the nuclear fuel up and out. But more importantly is the picture on page 6 of the press release that looks at the building from the side. Underneath that bump are large pieces of equipment that need extra clearance so they can pull the nuclear fuel up and down. But when you look at the structure from the side, you'll see that it's not connected at all to the reactor building or to the containment building on Unit 3. And that's a really important distinction. The anchor points on the new structure for Unit 3 are way over on the turbine building, which is on the right side of the picture, and onto the ground, which is on the left side of the picture. What that does is it creates a huge span. The gap between the turbine building and the opposite side of the reactor building is very, very long. What that's telling me is that Tokyo Electric cannot lift the 100-ton canisters with the arrangement they're proposing for Unit 3.
So you've talked about using smaller canisters before, removing less fuel in one go-around. Is that what you think they're doing now?
Yeah, back in September when I was in Tokyo, I had a chance to talk to Tokyo Electric in a public meeting. And they said that while they were going to go with the 100-ton cask on Unit 4, that they were considering going with a smaller cask on Unit 3. Now, to my way of thinking, I would have used a smaller cask on Unit 4 because they could have got the job done faster. But they obviously knew back then, but didn't tell me, that the span they needed to cover on Unit 3 was so large that they couldn't lift a 100-ton canister given the degraded condition of Unit 3.
And when you say span, what you mean is the area between the supports. So that's the, just like on a bridge, between the one end and the other, that's the area that needs to stay suspended in air and be able to lift that much weight.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Kevin. We'll make an engineer out of you sooner or later.
So why then do they need a longer span on Unit 3?
Well, I can't read Japanese, and I have a hunch that Tokyo Electric didn't actually come out and say it. But the real problem is that Unit 3 is so severely damaged that it can't handle the weight of a 100-ton canister. There's no place in Unit 3 that would be strong enough to brace a heavy crane.
So the span then is the area between the two support structures that needs to support the weight of those fuel rods being pulled out with a crane. Why such a long span on Unit 3 but not on Unit 4 or Unit 1?
Well, the longer the span, the weaker the span for the amount of metal that they can put into it. I think what it's showing is that the reactor building is not strong enough to handle any of the structural weight of this new modification. You know, I hope that, I know we have Japanese viewers, and hopefully some Japanese reporters will listen to this audio and ask Tokyo Electric, why is there a difference between Unit 3 and Unit 4? I think Tokyo Electric is going to say that the reactor building on Unit 3 has been so damaged that we can't find a place to brace the heavy-duty cranes, and therefore we have to span the whole structure. Now that creates a whole bunch of problems, though. A longer span means they can no longer lift this 100-ton cask. When I was in Tokyo, they suggested they had a 50-ton cask that they were considering, and I didn't know why. Now it's absolutely obvious that Unit 3 has been so damaged by the explosion that it can't handle the weight of the larger cask. Now, they're not telling people that, but clearly that's what the drawings show.
Is this going to slow down the removal of fuel?
Absolutely. I've been saying for about 10 months now that the explosion in Unit 3 is entirely different than the explosion in Unit 1 or 2 or 4. And I've been saying that it's a detonation shockwave. Whether or not it occurred in the fuel pool as a prompt moderated criticality, or it occurred, as Tokyo Electric seems to still believe, as a hydrogen explosion, that's irrelevant. What's important is that it was a detonation, not a deflagration. And this action by Tokyo Electric on Unit 3, basically admitting that there's no structural member strong enough in Unit 3, clearly shows that a detonation shockwave hit the Unit 3 building.
Anything more on that?
Well, that has ramifications around the world. Nuclear reactor containments are not designed for a detonation shockwave. And now we know one happened. So, one would think that regulators would redesign containments so that they could handle a detonation shockwave. But instead, at least here in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission isn't even discussing a detonation shockwave. I think if you did, you would have to shut down too many nuclear reactors, which is something that the NRC doesn't have the stomach to do.
Thank you, Arnie. I want to switch gears now and talk about a Japan Times article that came out last week, fish contamination. You've long been saying that the radioactive contamination will be working its way up through the food chain. That's something we can expect. Can you talk a little bit about this Japan Times article from last week?
Yeah, there was trout caught in a river in Fukushima Prefecture. Now, this is freshwater fish. All of the tuna, for instance, that were caught off of California were saltwater fish, but this is a freshwater fish, and the concentration of radioactivity in it was over 11,000 disintegrations per second in a 2-pound piece of fish. So normally there'll be a little tiny bit of cesium left over from the bomb program, a couple of disintegrations per second. So this is more than 1,000 times more radioactive than background. And equally important, it's more than 100 times higher than the limit set by the Japanese government for cesium in fish. And I think the important message here that seems to be lost is that trout is at the top of the food chain, and you get something called bioaccumulation. So what it's showing me is that the entire Fukushima prefecture is contaminated with cesium. The cesium is dropping onto the forest floor, getting washed into rivers, where it gets caught in the mud, the sediment on the bottom of on the rivers and lakes. Well, what happens then is the fish, small fish, eat the plants that are growing in the sediment. The small fish get eaten by bigger fish, and it works its way up to the trout. This is not a problem that's going to go away. This is a problem. Fukushima Prefecture is as big as the state of Connecticut. And we're basically saying that an area the size of Connecticut is going to be highly contaminated for decades, and that people fishing in the streams and ponds and lakes and dams are going to have to expect to be pulling up radioactive fish for decades to come.
Fukushima Daiichi has been leaching radiation into the ocean, but now you're saying that freshwater fish are being affected. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's been crystal clear that 80% of the radiation that was released from Fukushima Daiichi after the accident went out into the Pacific immediately. It either leaked from the buildings or it was blown through the air and wound up in the Pacific. The other 20% landed on Japan itself.